what is it that keeps the Ukraine war going? And also, how do you see the U.S. position changing? Because now I see Hegseth making the point that, we have to continue to help Ukraine. I'm not sure if this is just a rhetoric or, if the U.S. hasn't, well, that they don't necessarily want to put an end to the war. They rather just transfer responsibility to the Europeans. Well, again, short question then would be, what is it that keeps the war going?
I think it's a self-delusion. I think from the perspective of the European elite, they are winning the war in Ukraine. So there's reporting that the Ukrainians have pushed back the Russian offensive, and now the Ukrainians are gaining more territory. And quite honestly, right now, the Europeans live in their own elitist bubble, and you're only allowed into this bubble if you support the war completely. So if you're a dissenter, if you're trying to point out facts on the ground, for example, Ukraine has lost over 1 million men, and Ukraine doesn't have the resources to sustain this war, you're pushed out. You're considered a traitor. You're considered a pessimist, and then you're pushed out. So the people in Brussels just live in their own little fantasy world, and they're absolutely convinced that first of all, Ukraine is winning this war. Second of all, Russia is on the brink of economic collapse. Any day now, Russia will collapse economically. And third of all, Putin is on life support. The elite, the Russian elite, are so angry about this war that they're ready to rise up against him. So if we just wait one more day, either the Russian elite will overthrow Putin, or the Ukrainians will break into Crimea, or the Russian economy will collapse. If we just wait one more day, and quite honestly, once the elite, the European elite, fall into the solution, it's impossible to convince them otherwise. And that's why this war continues to this day.
Yeah, I noticed as well that after having to listen to the European elites and their, stenographers in the media saying Ukraine's winning for all these years, when it was obviously that they were being destroyed, it seemed like they were finally shifting towards, reality was catching up. They were saying, well, they're in a difficult spot. We might have to help them more. But now they seem to have returned back into, as yet Ukraine is winning. I don't know. I consider the European elites to be essentially social constructivists. They view it as, if you say that Ukraine is winning, then the public will throw the full support behind because they want to bet on the winning horse. And if they support it, then we can send the weapons, and then somehow we can win after all. If you accept reality as it is, that we're losing, then the public will withdraw its support, will try to mitigate the catastrophe of this loss, and then the money dries up, and then we lose. So I think they have, ideologically, they like to construct their own reality. The problem is, you can only do that for so long before you run into a wall. I just had a funny comment in this country. A newspaper wrote about me that when Decent says the world is multipolar, it's a way it gives Putin legitimacy, because it suggests that Russia is as a pole of power in a multipolar world, as opposed to just being China and the US. And so we should not call it multipolar, because this gives legitimacy to Russia. So we're forced essentially to live in a fake world, world of delusion. Otherwise, if you recognize the world as it is, you can, legitimize our enemies, and as you said, you're kicked out of polite society. But it's
And sorry, but another point that's very important is that in order to maintain their fantasy, they will sacrifice everything. So basically, the Europeans are gearing up for total war. The Germans are planning a conscription. So they will fight this war to the last Ukrainian and to the last European. They will not give up their fantasy.
well, this is where I was wondering where you see this going, though, because my concern, what I've been saying for at least the past 12, 13 years, is we should not go down this path towards a war with Russia. That is, very basic. If you try to push NATO into Ukraine, my argument was always, it would be like the Russians establishing themselves in Mexico. It's there's only, the only outcome possible here is war, and eventually Ukraine would be destroyed, and the escalation would compel Russia to retaliate. Again, if Russia sees this an existential threat, there's no way it's going to back down. So either we go to nuclear war or we defeat it. But how do you see then this where this war will be going? Because I think the Russians now, their calculations, at least what I hear from Moscow, is that the mood has shifted dramatically. That is after the Europeans especially expressing the intent, and now also the ambition to develop the capabilities to fight Russia. And they couldn't be more clear in this language. There's no more point to pretend as if, be afraid of having a direct war, because at the moment the Europeans are striking Russia and Russia's not striking back. So the war is already here. So what is there to be deterred about? The Russians should restore their deterrence. At least that's what I'm hearing. So I was wondering, how do you see it? Where is this going to go?
Yeah, so I see that there's a larger American grand strategy behind all this, right? So for the longest time in a unipolar world, America guaranteed peace and safety for everyone. And that's what allowed for global trade, and that's what allowed for a period of tremendous peace and prosperity. And now that America has $39 trillion in debt, and now that the American economy has basically been hollowed out because they've financialized their economy and they shifted their manufacturing to China, now America cannot afford to guarantee peace and safety for the world. And so what America wants to do is shift the world into one of continuous conflict. So the grand vision is that America retreats back into the Western Hemisphere. It's something called the Donroe Doctrine, where it's complete control over all the nations of the Western Hemisphere, including Venezuela, Cuba. But after Cuba, then we can imagine the Americans will target Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Colombia. It's all part of this greater North America project, right? So you create a fortress, North America, and then you plunge the world into war by causing conflicts throughout the world. So in Europe, there'll be a war between the Russians versus Ukrainians, backed by the Germans, the French, and the British. And that'll be a continuous war that could go on for decades. And while this war is raging, America will provide financing, armaments, and resources to Europeans to ensure that they will fight this war to the last European, right? And by doing this, the Americans can sustain their national debt and grow their economy. In Asia Pacific, we're seeing the same thing played out, where the Shangri-La forum just concluded in Singapore, and China didn't really go. I mean, China did send a representative, but China was not there. Peter Hegseth was there. The Japanese were there. The Filipinos were there. And I think what's going to happen is that the Americans retreat from the Asia Pacific and let Japan and South Korea do more of the heavy lifting. And they'll be backed up by American allies in the first island chain, specifically the Philippines. And the goal is to force these nations to come in conflict with each other so that they're now, again, forced to buy American armaments and resources. And so that's the world that America wants to create, a war of continuous conflict, which is very similar to World War II. Remember, the World War II was the greatest thing for America. Trump talks about how to make America great again. Well, World War II is what made America great, because the Europeans exhausted themselves on a battlefield, and then the Japanese exhausted themselves on the battlefield in China. And then towards the end, the Americans came up and cleaned house and conquered the world and established Pax Americana. So I would not be surprised if American strategists were not planning the same thing, where they want to plunge the world back into World War III, and then America will be left alone, and America can rebuild its manufacturing base. And eventually, when the time is right, America will then conquer the world again and establish Pax Americana again. That, I think, is the larger grand strategy here.
Well, yeah, I got the same impression. I think the European leaders, they saw the Ukraine war as essentially, the European leaders sitting at the table, moving the Ukrainian pieces around against the Russians. I don't think they realized yet that the political West doesn't exist in its former form. That is, the Europeans, they have become pieces of the table now, that well, the fight to the last Ukrainian, it will essentially soon be the fight to the last European. So I think they also don't realize that they're proxies of America. They think they're allies with completely overlapping interests. But the problem, I think, is that they have very wrong expectations because they look the last 4 years very, they have proper escalation control. They're able to manage the battlefield well. And the assumption, I think, is that that it will essentially just be a continuation of this slow war in the trenches of Donbass, where they essentially tilted in the favor of the Europeans and the Ukrainians. I don't think the Russians would fight a war with the Europeans in any way similar to what we've seen the past 4 years. I think the brutality would be much, much more vicious, and it would be fought more on European territory. But well, essentially, my question.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. No, I have one more point to make about Europe, which is like right now, Europe is controlled by bureaucrats. These are not leaders. These are not visionaries. These are not people who are responsible to the people. They're just bureaucrats, meaning that they live in their own fantasy world, meaning they refuse to take responsibility for their actions, and meaning that they turn a blind eye to reality. So what they're really trying to do is not take blame for the defeat of Project Ukraine. they're just trying to pass the buck. They're trying to prolong this war as long as possible so that they can retire into their nice pensions and then leave the problems to the successors. These are not competent leaders. These are just lazy bureaucrats.
Well, I may have used the word leader a bit generously there, so no, I don't disagree with that label, calling them bureaucrats.